Welcome into the 14 podcast. I'm Chris Lee, the host. Got a special guest today. Good friend of mine in the business. He is one of the hardest workers I know in this profession. He knows South Carolina football as well as anybody. He is Chris Clark of Gamecock Central. Chris, thank you for taking time out of a busy schedule to join us this time of the year. Hope you're doing well.
Yeah, I'm doing well. Same to you. Always good to catch up with you and chat, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to come on with you.
Well, I know that Carolina has flown underneath the radar with some of the stories in the league, with what's going on at Georgia and Alabama, with the, I don't know if you call it collapse or whatever, at LSU and A&M's underachievement. And I watched Carolina. I've watched them several times. And they're 3-2. I know the wins are Eastern Illinois, East Carolina, and Troy. But there was also a 6-point loss to Kentucky in there. I watched them. It's obvious they're very improved. It's obvious they play with the passion. How would you evaluate the job that Coach Shane Beamer has done in his first year?
Man, that is a really interesting question, and one that we could spend the entire podcast talking about just that one question probably. So, obviously he walked into, a difficult situation. The locker room in South Carolina, there was a lot of just kind of like disappointment and hurt from the past couple of years. You got to remember, last year was a very trying season for a lot of teams, and especially that was the case in Columbia. They, the COVID shortened season, the all conference schedule, they won 2 games. They were 2-8. There are a lot of issues, a lot of normal issues that come with losing, like that. Lots of injuries, the COVID opt-out situation. The end of the year, it just wasn't fun. Nobody was happy, and it's understandable as to why. The year before that, they won 4 games, and it kind of, slipped. I mean, Will Muschamp's tenure, they had really kind of risen, right? He won 6 games year one, 9 the next year, and so they had kind of moved up in that regard, but then they kind of started to backslide. And Beamer walked into that situation where you're coming off a COVID year, you can't recruit anybody in person, you're a brand new coaching staff. It literally, the set of circumstances, Chris, this isn't hyperbole. It had never happened in college football, right? To inherit a situation like that. On top of that, you've got, when you kind of look at the conference outlook in the schedule, Clemson, while they have slid some this year, they've been an elite program. That's your primary rival. Georgia has recruited, just like gangbusters, and they're obviously completely loaded. They're probably the best team in the country right now. Kentucky, we've seen Kentucky. They've done a great job. They've been on the rise. They right now are the team that you look, behind Georgia and Florida, and well ahead of Florida now because they beat those guys. They've made a significant move. Tennessee, measuring stick game coming up this weekend. So it's a tough set of circumstances, and I think that's important context, right? The defense really struggled for Carolina last year. The offense really struggled. So there's just a lot of work to do from a roster standpoint. Then you're installing new schemes, a brand new staff. I think he made some good hires. Pete Limbo, the special teams coordinator, has been great. And they've struggled to run the ball, which is the one thing we thought this team could do. They've been maybe better in some other areas. And I think defensively, they've been able to mask some issues in the back end and at linebacker to where they've been a fairly effective group. Are there issues? Sure. But here's kind of how I really boil it down, Chris, is they're about where most people would have them. Maybe the exception of the Kentucky game. I think that was kind of a swing game since it was at home. It ended up being a 6-point game largely because Kentucky put the ball on the ground, turned it over so many times, and it could have been worse on that front. It was a close loss, and that is not a shock, right? With where Kentucky is, with where South Carolina is in year one of the Beamer era, that's to anybody coming into this year that's saying, oh, they've absolutely got to win the Kentucky game. Like, that's the game they should win. That would have been, quite frankly, that would have been kind of asinine, right? Now, could they have won it? Yes. Should they have won it? You could even say that, given how the game played out. They were so poor offensively in that game. But nobody expected them to beat Georgia, right? Like, they were 2-1 after that. They dropped the Kentucky game to go to 2-2. They beat Troy. It wasn't pretty, but they beat Troy. So they're kind of where a lot of people would expect them to be at. So the rest of the schedule, they've got some tough games. Really, this year it's about kind of can you sneak into a bowl? Can you improve the team? Can you maximize the team's potential? That's how Beamer's always talked about it. He said this will be a successful year if we can take this team's potential, whatever that is, and maximize it. And I think they've done that in some areas, in others they have not. For example, the run game. But I think largely what it's going to boil down to, Chris, is recruiting. I mean, the best teams have the best players. That's kind of what it comes down to. And so this 2022 class will be important. Even more so, the 2023 class will be very, very important to the future of this program. And so, I think it's been a solid start overall. The locker room is in, I think, better shape. The way that Shane Beamer structured his program from a culture standpoint, involving more former Gamecocks, there was a lot more positivity going into the season, and I think that's helped them, weather some more adversity in some of these games early on.
Chris, he was the guy, he being Shane Beamer, that a lot of folks at Carolina seemed to want. You and I talked a few times last year after that job came open, and I know that you thought he would get the job. And I remember just thinking a little skeptically, hey, look, Carolina's a pretty good job. It's an SEC job. There's a lot of head coaches out there with experience that I'm sure would want that job, and I'm sure did want that job. And I thought it was a little bit of a risk to hire a guy who'd never been a head coach before. But that's who the people at Carolina wanted. And they seemed very infatuated with him. I don't say that in a derogatory way. That's how I read the situation from where I am. But I can see it now after watching him on TV, after watching the excitement that he's tried to interject in the program, after seeing how much he's improved this team. He's a guy who seems, I don't know if I want to say charismatic, because it might give off the wrong impression, but I think likable at a minimum and just energetic in his personality. After kind of watching this from afar and seeing what he's done and just seeing how he interacts with people, I can get why he's the guy that they were very excited about.
Yeah, and I think some of those traits and those characteristics that you hit on there are things that help Beamer during the interview process. And I think going back to the search, I would be lying if I said that, he was the number one candidate at first, like first iteration, first couple of days of the coaching search. Was he the guy that was like the primary focus? No, I don't believe so based on what I know, but it did not take long for him to ascend there. And that, by saying that, I do not mean he was a fallback option. He was not. He ended up being their top guy out of the candidates that were involved in this job. And it didn't take long for him to get there. And I think as the process went on, his plan and his fit at the university, that was the biggest thing. There are a lot of good football coaches out there, right? There are a lot of guys that know how to recruit or have a track record at recruiting at this school or that school. But he rose up above some guys that are sitting head coaches that have been quite successful, guys with good resumes, guys who have coached under some, really good coaches. And he kind of rose above all those. And it was kind of a unique hire, but I think that's kind of what South Carolina was looking for, was a unique hire. You think about what they've done, the past few hires. You hire Lou Holtz, right, who was a legendary coach who had a national title, a huge pedigree. Then you get Steve Spurrier. I mean, you're very fortunate to get those two hires, right? Two guys who happen to be available, who are, two of the best coaches in college football history. Then you hire Will Muschamp, right? Because he'd been an SEC coach before, recruiting pedigree, defensive mindset, et cetera, et cetera. And this time, I think they just looked around and looked at Shane Beamer, who was born in Charleston. He's a younger guy. I think he was 43 when he got the job. This was his dream job to get back to South Carolina. He's always stayed plugged in. I mean, Beamer recorded the South Carolina football coaches show on TV every week and watched it. Kept up with the roster. He's got recruiting ties here. He knows a lot of the coaches and the landscape in the SEC. He's coached on every side of the ball. and he just kind of had a unique plan, and he wanted to be here. And that kind of counts, with just all the factors that they were looking at. He's a guy that was here, during kind of the start of a very successful run, 2007 to 2010. He saw some of the recruits come through that ended up being the cornerstone for that team. His last year at South Carolina, they won the SEC East for the only time ever. He would then go on and leave, but that the foundation had been laid at that point. So he's just got kind of an intriguing background, and the way that he wanted to structure his program. You look at the culture. Every single coach talks about culture. It's basically a buzzword now. But I think what Beamer's done is he's kind of actually put something behind that. He always says he doesn't want that to just be words on the wall when you walk in the football facility. And so some of these values that he's talked about, that's really how he tries to run the program. So he's really endeared himself to the fan base because he's been so involved from a community standpoint, social media. And I think those are things that, frankly, they kind of needed.
Chris, the thing that stands out in terms of tangible on-field stuff is what he's done with that defense, which I think last year, you can correct me if I'm wrong, they allowed 36 points, which I think was the worst in the history of the school. Is that correct?
I couldn't tell you that was I couldn't confirm that stat. It would not surprise me. And the defense definitely really struggled last season, no doubt.
Yeah, it was bad. They were giving up 36 points a game, 452 yards. This year, those numbers are 17.4 and 302. And look, I know that some of that schedule. Last year was an all-SEC schedule. This year, it's been easier in terms of some of the out-of-conference teams on the slate. And I get that, but you talk about the culture. I think that's a valid point. That's hard to change. They lost a first-round corner. What's been the secret in what he's done to turn this around?
I think there are a couple of things there. One of them is this, and this is going to sound more negative, but I don't really intend it to be that way. I think I mentioned earlier the kind of smoke and mirrors of the defense, right? I think back to like Will Muschamp's 2017 defense is probably the best one they had. A lot of that was based on some turnovers. Like there was smoke and mirrors to that. They had some guys that were very good. Sky Moore, Dante Sawyer, Chris Lamont. They were skilled kind of turnover guys, and that really helped them. So there's almost a parallel to that this year. This team's been really, really good at getting turnovers. I think they had 9 interceptions this year. There have been several fumbles. There have been 2 potential defensive scores wiped off the board because of penalties. They had a scoop and score fumble last week. I'm sure everybody saw it. Jamar Brown dropped the ball short of the goal line. They had another defensive score wiped out in the EIU game. I think it was going to at least be an interception. They may have stepped out. It might have been a pick six that was wiped off the board. So even taking those out, been several fumble recoveries. There have been pick sixes, lots of interceptions. So they've done a really good job with that. That has helped kind of mask some of the issues that we've seen. They've been better against the run in some games. They've been inconsistent. But the problem is we knew that the big concern was the back seven, the linebacker depth, which took a hit when Sherrod Green went down in the Georgia game early, and the defensive backs. That said, they have, I think the biggest improvement is there are just some guys on the roster, including some that haven't done much, that have just developed individually. They lost J.C. Horn. They lost Jamie Robinson and John Dixon to transfer, FSU and Penn State, respectively, and they lost Izzy McCormick, who plays for the Cowboys now. They lost all those guys. And now you're starting Darius Rush at corner, who's never been a starter, Jaylen Foster, a former walk-on who ended up starting last year, but, had a fairly unremarkable career. Jaylen Foster's, tied for the national lead in interceptions, and he's done a really nice job for this team. So there have been some guys, I think, that have just developed, even some guys on the D-line, like a Zach Pickens, former 5-star, and has been solid, through his first 2 years, but he's kind of taken that next step. So there's been some really good individual development, and I think that's everything from conditioning to culture and creating belief in players. Is something that Beamer talks about a lot, kind of empowering them. The defensive scheme with Clayton White, I think, is simple but effective, and it kind of lets the players play loose and free. Now, there are still plenty of mistakes. There's still, I think, a talent deficit when they play certain teams. And some of that's been exposed, and I think it'll be exposed a few more times this season, potentially. But there's no doubt that they've been able to get turnovers. They've been able to hunker down and come up with some big stops in certain situations. And it's definitely, for the fan base, it's been more fun to watch this year.
You talk about that touchdown wiped off the board last week. That was one of the craziest plays I've ever seen. Two fumbles on the same play, and then he flips the ball about the half-yard line, and it comes back. I was watching that live, and just, at first I thought they were going to the replay to check one of the fumbles, and I didn't even notice that he had flipped the ball up until later.
Yeah, same here, and that was kind of an odd game. There was one replay that they waited. They had a 3.5, 4-minute TV timeout. Then when they were coming out of the timeout, they decided to review the play, and everybody's like, well, what are we doing here? But yeah, that's what everybody thought, is that they were just reviewing. I think Damani Staley, the Mike linebacker, had originally picked up that ball on the strip sack, and I think they were looking originally to see if that knee was down, because it was kind of close. And then they discovered that on the replay. And I didn't notice it live either, Chris. I saw it later. When they said, touchback live, I was kind of like, what are we talking about here? And had to go back and look at it. But that was actually something else that, as a larger point, kind of illustrates how they've tried to do things. They've had way too many penalties and mistakes this year. That's been a huge storyline. So some of the penalties have been ridiculous and really held this team back. But Jamar Brown actually stood up in front of the media the following week, and Beamer's been great about letting players talk to the media even when they're injured or something happened. And I mean, he completely owned it, and said it was a teaching point. And, it was just, I thought it was a phenomenal, example of taking ownership. And the coaches have done that too. Beamer, Marcus Satterfield, the OC, because there's been some offensive issues. They're very quick to go up there and take accountability. And I think that's something that Shane Beamer has tried to really, instill in this team.
There's two guys on this defense I want to talk about for a moment. You mentioned Jaylen Foster. Let's start with him. He is, I think, as you mentioned, tied for the national lead in interceptions. I didn't know anything about him until he popped on the radar this year. His story, from what I know, he was freshman of the year at Gardner-Webb in the Big South. That's all the way back to 2016. Transferred to Carolina, sat out a year, was a scout team guy the next year, then I think had a minor role, got a scholarship last year, and now he's a big-time player for them. What can you tell us about that story?
It has been kind of wild. He got to Carolina, walked on, as you said, as a transfer, and at one point had actually entered the transfer portal again from Carolina, but withdrew from the transfer portal, came back. He ended up playing last season and starting some games, even, as I recall, towards the end of the year, just because South Carolina was down so many guys, at the end of the year. And so he got some experience, and he'd been playing some special teams and got, a taste of starting and playing a good bit last season at safety. Now, coming into this year, I mentioned all those defections that they had earlier, right? They had, the 4 guys, 2 transfers and then 2 NFL defections from that secondary. And so not only the starters, but the depth, it was a huge question. And so they had a bunch of guys on the roster that had either not really played or had kind of played bit roles or had injury histories, like a Jalen Dickerson, to where it was a significant question. Foster has just done a great job because he's been a team leader. People inside the building just absolutely love him. They say that he's worked his tail off. He leads. He does things the right way, and so he's getting rewarded for that with his play. I think you look at the ball skills. He's done a really nice job just kind of being around the ball. He had an interception against Kentucky. He's he's had, well, like I said, he's tied for the national lead, at last check in interceptions this season. Had another one wiped off the board against EIU. That was also a great play. He calls that strip sack. He blitzed off the edge, well-timed blitz, and a great play to cause that strip sack against Troy. So he's just, he's always had some ability. Is he the most physically gifted safety in the conference? No. But he just does things the right way. He's an instinctual player, and he's an example of one of those guys that's really just kind of developed and flourished defensively under the new staff.
Another guy on that defense that really makes them go, Kingsley Enagbare, who I have seen pop up in some mock first rounds. His Pro Football Focus numbers are off the chart, and he's scoring a 92. And one thing about defensive linemen I think people overlook, you see some of the kids at Georgia and Alabama, they've got so many great bodies that some of those guys are playing 40% of the snaps. He's played 211 this year. That's a lot. I mean, that is a beating for a defensive lineman to take. So I think that number, it's not just the performance, it's the volume of snaps that he's had. Of course, He was really good a year ago, but how good a season do you think he's having? The numbers aside, what are your eyes telling you?
Yeah, I mean, he's having a really good year. And I think, as you said, Chris, if they're playing 65 to 70 snaps in a game, he's probably at around the 45 to 50 mark. So he's taken probably, 75% of the snaps in most games. And look, most of the games have been close, exception of, the Georgia game, or the EIU game. He didn't have to play as much because they were up so big. But he's done a great job. That JJ was one of the guys in the off season that there was kind of a wonder of, okay, this guy's a big time player. He's got an NFL future. Is the new staff going to be able to keep him? Because you got the portal and all that stuff. They had some other defections. It was kind of a question, but he totally balled in. I mean, he seemed to love what Beamer was all about. I think he could have even had an NFL decision last year, but coming into this year, he was already, according to some NFL, connected folks I talked to, it was already kind of viewed, Chris, that if this guy has the kind of season that he should, he's probably a second, round pick, somewhere in that range. But he's continued with his strong play to where, as you said, some people think he could be a first round type of guy. He's a 4-star guy out of high school. I don't think he was like a top 100 kid, but he was a really good get. He's a very good pass rusher. That's his thing. I mean, he's got a variety of moves. He's got good size. He can bend. He can run. He's got all those things. So he's played quite well, and there's certainly a chance that he could be, the next first-round pick. If not, he's certainly going to go, pretty high in the next draft.
Chris, I think, and we talked pre-podcast about this, the one thing that I think we had said that we thought was South Carolina's strength coming into this year was the running game. And that's not materialized. They're averaging 3.5 yards a carry. Kevin Harris, I thought, was probably the best back in the league coming in. I know Tank Bigsby would have a voice in that conversation, but let's face it. I mean, the talent at Auburn and some of the other running backs around the league have surrounding those guys was better than what Harris had. And I think that really says something when you produce at a high level, when you don't have a lot of studs around you. And so with that, I think that's been the one thing that's been the disappointment. Harris had preseason back surgery, missed some time. I know you think that, the numbers that he's produced so far, he's getting 3.1 a carry, are really more due to the circumstances. But talk about that running game, what's gone wrong, and is Harris a guy that in the second half of the year we see more of 2020 Kevin Harris than what we've seen so far?
Yeah, and it's kind of a complicated, multifaceted issue. So, yeah, as you correctly pointed out, Chris, Harris was limited in the spring with a back issue, missed preseason camp, had a minor procedure on that back to correct something, and then he actually missed the EIU game and was kind of just limited coming back in until the Georgia game. He was kind of unleashed then. I think the staff felt he was ready to take on more snaps in that game, and they put him out there I think primarily because of the physicality of Georgia's defense, and Kevin's a very physical runner. And so there wasn't much running room in that game, as you can imagine, but he still, doled out some blows of his own. And, last season, to back up, their expectations for this Gamecock offense were not high going into this year. You knew you're going to be starting Luke Doty, who also, by the way, missed time a month with a foot injury. And so, the thought was, look, there's not a lot to hang your hat on for this Gamecock offense, but the thought was, even on a poor team last year, a poor offensive team, they still were able to run the ball. Kevin Harris led the SEC in rushing. They've got 4 of the 5 offensive linemen back from last season. So, hey, at a minimum, you should be able to run the ball, right? Well, they haven't done that, and I think there's several reasons for it. Everybody was excited about the O-line coming back, Harris coming back. Then you stack up that they had Zaquandre White, who started the first couple games. They had have a talented little freshman named Juju McDowell, who's given them a spark, and then a former 5-star, Marshawn Lloyd, who missed last year with an ACL, and everybody was, excited to get him going and see how he fit in. So 4 talented backs, an offensive line with some experience and on paper some talent, and guys that have done it before, but it just hasn't clicked, and I think there's a lot of reasons for it. I mean, Kevin missing some time, sure. Marshawn's still getting back in the swing of things, sure. Juju's more of kind of an outside runner. But, I think at times there have been some mistakes. There have been some miscommunications. Obviously, there's some schematic changes, so I think they're still working through those things. But when you kind of watch it, you can go through any given play that has not hit, and you can kind of just go through and point out, okay, a miscommunication here. Okay, they checked a play here, and the linemen aren't on the same page with what they're doing. Here, they let a guy through. There's just been a lot of different issues there. And we didn't see those as much last season. I will say they did have a lot of negative plays last year to go with a lot of really big, running plays. So there's no doubt that this offense it's not going to be a very good or great offense. If they could get the run game going and eliminate some of the mistakes that have plagued this team, they could be an average or a serviceable offense, which is really all anyone expected, I think, going into this year.
Well, you mentioned quarterback. They had one of the most interesting stories of fall camp. You had Zeb Nolan, who was on the staff as a GA. He was back up at North Dakota State to a high first-round pick there, which explains a little bit of why he didn't play. But the quarterback situation got so dire that they had to call him in and put some pads on him. And, of course, he goes out and leads them to an opening game victory. They get Luke Doty back in the meantime, who's the guy that they intended all along. Nolan had a hand injury a couple weeks back. I haven't really seen an update on that. But is Doty their guy for the rest of the season going forward, do you think?
He is. And what happened there is that they were trying to kind of get Luke back and bring him along to where, like, from a physical perspective, from as far as the injury, like, he was okay, but there was still soreness. There was the fact that the guy had missed a month of practice. Fast forward to the Georgia game, and, he's available for the game technically. Would he have played if Nolan didn't get his hand, basically cleated in that game? I don't even know if Doty would have played or played a lot, right? Doty had really, Chris, only practiced, like, full practice 11 on 11 that Thursday of the Georgia game. And he's been very limited before that. And then he was completely out of practice for, a long period of time in the preseason and then during the season. So, and look, on top of that, this is a guy that had only started and played in 2.5 games last year. So he was a freshman last year. So he's still very inexperienced, and he's in a new offense and all those things. Well, Nolan gets his hand stepped on. And by the way, he's fine and available now if needed. And Doty comes in against the best defense in the country, bar none, and he performed pretty well, The Kentucky game, or there's some throws that Doty wants to have back, et cetera. Yeah, but, like, he has played well. I think he's even arguably surpassed expectations, especially when you view it under the lens of the circumstances, missing so much time, not having any run game to speak of. not being able to run as much as he wants on scrambles or on zone reads, he's still coming along with that foot. And I think maybe this weekend, maybe later in the season, you're going to see Luke get more comfortable as a runner, but there's still some issues there with that foot injury, to where you're, trusting it being 100%. He's not been quite there yet. And so given all those circumstances and not having a great receiving core by any means, there have been some questions there, and I think he's answered the bell. So he's definitely the guy, barring injury. He's continuing to come along. I think the staff is pretty happy overall with how he's played.
Chris, I want to talk about the path to bowl eligibility for Carolina in a minute, but first that starts with Tennessee this Saturday in Knoxville. Yeah. The Vols are 10.5-point favorites, and frankly, when I look at that matchup, and I think a lot of maybe what happened in Columbia might be as much on Missouri as it is on Tennessee, but the fact is the Vols are also a coach who's made that program markedly better in year one. They've got an offensive identity with an offensive-minded coach, and they put 62 on an SEC team last week with over 700 yards of offense. The biggest issue I see for Carolina in that game is Tennessee's offense seems to have a gear that Carolina's does not. If Carolina pulls an upset in Knoxville, what's that look like?
Yeah, and as you said, there are some very concerning things from a matchup standpoint. Like, I think this is, aside from Georgia, right, who's they're just head and shoulders above everyone right now, almost everyone. I think this is a tougher matchup from a opponent offense versus Carolina defense matchup than, even Kentucky, because Carolina's, defense performed admirably in that game overall. Tennessee, they present problems with tempo, right? And we know that they like to run the ball. They're actually running the ball at a higher clip than anybody in the conference. They go fast. They like to take, deep shots. They can throw short. And the quarterback, Hendon Hooker, is a dual threat guy too. So there's all that to worry about. But then I kind of look at it, Chris, as, Missouri, that was a horrific performance by them. They fired their defensive line coach after that game. It was kind of bizarre if you watch that game, how things happen from an effort standpoint and all that. But I look at that tape and I look at what Tennessee does in the run game, and I see some of the issues that we've seen at South Carolina defensively. Again, some of which have gone masked, or some that have not been talked about because people are so hyper-focused on the offensive struggles. And I do not think it's a good matchup. Kentucky's got a good offensive line. The way they administer their offense is tough. I think we've seen some bad angles, some missed tackles. The linebacker play has been pretty suspect the past couple of weeks. Troy, Chris, could not run the ball at all this season. And it's not like they tore it up against South Carolina, but they had some successful runs that were kind of eye-popping. And I think that was alarming for the Gamecocks, particularly given this matchup. So I say all that to lay out the concerns. You asked about the path to winning this game. Here's one. Kind of do what you've done all year and get turnovers. The problem is you can't count on those. Sometimes you can create them. Sometimes they're kind of gifted to you and you have to take advantage. Tennessee, has been pretty decent in terms of taking care of the ball. I think they've thrown one pick this year overall. South Carolina's got 9, I think. So something's got to give there. But I think just playing disciplined, dealing with the tempo, that's certainly something. And getting turnovers would help. On the other hand, South Carolina's got to score. They're scoring, an offensive touchdown a game. That's just not going to cut it. So they're going to have to go to Knoxville. They've moved the ball some this year, but they've got to eliminate the penalties that have held them back. It was really, really ridiculous almost in the Troy game how much that happened. They've got to be able to run the ball, and they need to be able to punch it in. After they cross the 50, go finish a drive. And we haven't seen enough of that this year. That's what it's going to take in Knoxville.
Chris, I want to talk about the path to bowl eligibility. I look down the schedule. Of course, they've banked 3 wins already. And I'm not talking about the 5-7 path, which I guess maybe could happen. But
Sure.
I look at them. They got Vanderbilt coming up on October the 16th. They have owned that series. I think they've won 13 in a row or something like that. That game's in Columbia. Vanderbilt is easily 2 touchdowns worse than they are. So that's one I'm going to chalk up to them. I look, they've got Missouri November 13th in Columbia. Look, if effort issues are already showing up, and Carolina at least has shown the ability to get some stops, whereas Missouri has not. I'm going to give the Gamecocks an edge in that one. So let's say that they got 5 wins with that. The rest of the schedule, again, they go to Tennessee this Saturday. They go to Texas A&M October the 23rd. Florida in Columbia, Auburn in Columbia, Clemson in Columbia. What's the best shot at a win outside of Vanderbilt and Missouri?
That is the $1 million question.
It really is.
I've tried to handicap it in my mind going into the year. If we're going to kind of rate it on a scale, I would have had the Clemson game as, like the ESPN FPI, which by the way has Tennessee is like almost 80%, favorite this weekend. I would have had Clemson at probably, 97% to win that game. I still would pick the Tigers as of right now, no doubt. But it's lower because of some of the struggles that we've seen from them, right? Like offensively, their defense is still really good, but there's some questions there. A&M has been kind of unimpressive. They go and they really struggle against they eke one out against a bad Colorado team. Arkansas took care of them, which Arkansas is a good team. So that one's more winnable than I thought. Florida in Columbia, that's kind of a maybe. I'm probably picking, I haven't finalized my pick, to be honest with you, Chris, as we sit here and record this. I don't think I'm going to pick the Tennessee game as a win. So it's kind of like, which one out of those are the best chance? I probably would still say Tennessee. You got Auburn in there too, which is, I think that'll be a tough matchup. It might still be Tennessee, and if you don't win that game, the path that you're talking about becomes a lot tougher because, you got several games at home, but they're against Auburn, who's a very capable team. They're against Clemson, which is still among the most talented teams in the country, or against Florida, who I think is going to cause major issues, when facing the Gamecock defense. You got to go on the road to A&M, which is contractually obligated as part of South Carolina's membership in the SEC for them to never beat A&M in football, apparently, because they've been so close the past few years. So I might still say it's Tennessee. Now that said, even if they drop that game this weekend, if they can take care of Vandy, the Missouri game's still a question in the line. If they can get that, then you got to go steal one, and then it becomes which one can you steal. So it'll be fascinating to watch it play out.
I want to get your opinion on some SEC overall matters for this year before I ask you a basketball question or two on Carolina. Georgia or Alabama, who you got as the better team right now?
I've got Georgia, actually.
So do I.
Alabama, to me, their offense is, of course, really good. They had a lot of questions coming in, having to replace a lot of production, but they've recruited so well on that side of the ball, and they look really good. To me, Georgia has recruited a lot better on defense, and they're playing a lot better on defense. Is Alabama's defense still, a lot of talent, et cetera? Yes. But I just looked at Georgia's defense. There are people, Chris, that I've talked to in college football, been around the game for a while, that say that's the best college defense they've ever seen. And I kind of thought the same when I saw them this year. Since I've been covering it, is it the best? Kind of said, am I falling victim to recency bias? Because you think about some of those Alabama defenses earlier in Saban's tenure, and just how they just swallowed people. But I thought to myself, the scoring at that point in college football was still low. So I think when you look at kind of the era versus era comparison, scoring has gone up in college football. What Georgia is doing is amazing. There's a stat that I saw The Athletic put out. It was a PFF and someone else, I can't properly quote it, unfortunately, and it's basically it's the percentage of an opponent's drives that end in, a turnover on downs, and basically just a lack of success. And Georgia was, of course, number one. We were giving up like, I don't know, a quarter of a point per drive or something. I mean, just something absurd, South Carolina actually jumped from near the bottom last year, and they're, I think, 21st now. So they've made a jump there. But I think it's just an incredible defense. They're solid on special teams. And this Georgia team can score, too. It's not like they're just out there with a serviceable offense. They have, I think, three 5-star running backs, or 2 5-stars and 3 4-stars they trot out there. And, they're really good. So, to me, I've got Georgia there right now. Now, head-to-head, we'll see what happens, if those two teams end up meeting up.
Yeah, we've seen Saban do that before, where you get to game time, he finds a little something. So I'm with you. I think Georgia's the better team right now, but I'm not conceding that game to the Bulldogs just because Nick's usually got a thing or two in his bag of tricks.
He does, and that's what people are saying is, there's kind of a reason that Saban has always beat up on his former assistants, and people are kind of making jokes about, that Georgia looks better now, but once Kirby actually runs into Saban head to head, he won't win. But I don't know. I do think that if it's going to happen, this is the year it would happen, right? Because I think Alabama has shown, a few vulnerabilities, especially defensively, that Georgia, if they meet up and they play a complete game, they're so good defensively. I could see, them winning this year. Now, Alabama, we know, is so good passing the ball. That's been the one kind of issue on that Georgia defense is their secondary is not the best. They're still really good, but they've shown some susceptibilities to long balls and given up some plays in the passing game. So.
Well, Chris, I know you and I both look at Pro Football Focus, and I do a thing every week. I try to rate the top 14 and top offensive and defensive players in the league. Those are separate lists, and it's kind of a fun exercise. And I look at PFF grades. I don't go solely by those. But one of the things with Georgia that's made it tough to know what to do with their guys is they're so stinking deep that you look in the snap counts, you compare their frontline guys to the rest of the league, and you got their counterparts having played over 100 more snaps. So it's a little easier to do your job when you don't have to be on the field as much and get some rest. And when you're in there, you're not as fatigued, all those things. But I looked, and I thought, man, some of these snap counts are really low. Then I realized Georgia's only had 279 snaps on defense all year in 5 games, which is just crazy this day and age in college football.
Yeah, it is. And, I think Channing Tindall, who's actually Columbia, South Carolina native and is an absolute animal at linebacker, like, at least earlier in the season, he wasn't even a starter for them. And I talked to a bunch of people after the Clemson game when Georgia beat Clemson, and they were like, that number 41, he's just everywhere. He's an animal. He made so many plays and just completely disrupted Clemson. I went back and looked. He played 11 snaps in the game. So it's like it's like all 11 of his snaps are impactful. But you're right, that they can roll guys in and out. And they've just got so much depth offensively and defensively, Chris. You go up and look at their roster, their depth chart, you're on like the third line, you're on the third string, right? You're okay, Brock Vandagriff, 5-star, at quarterback. You've got, Keely Ringo, a former 5-star DB, like not always a starter for Georgia back there. It's just kind of absurd, what they've been able to stack there. And so they do have a ton of depth. Defensively, they're able to stay fresh just because they're so good. They're so fast and powerful up in that front seven. That's really where things start for them. They're just able to completely disrupt, what teams do.
Yeah, they've got 23 guys who played at least 50 snaps, and then they've got guys after that. It's absurd, and they don't even have their best defensive back, the guy that I thought might be coming to the year, the Smith kid who was the WVU transfer. That's just the state of that program. But I want to put you on the spot a minute. I want to ask you something that somebody asked me on air yesterday. We know Georgia and Alabama are the best team in the SEC. And by the way, you don't necessarily have to go by record because there's a big disparity in who teams have played so far. But who's the best team in the league after those two, in your opinion?
Ooh, that is an on-the-spot. Georgia and Alabama. So I'm trying to kind of sort through the options in my head, which I'll probably end up doing out loud.
Well, let me help you out a little bit. I'll tell you the answer I gave, and I know they just lost. I still think it's Florida.
Yeah, so the ones that I came up with, I think there were, three? Florida, Arkansas, and Kentucky. I mean, doesn't Kentucky have the right to be there right now?
Yeah.
I mean, they're undefeated. Auburn, I still think looks like a pretty good team. They lost to Penn State. Probably one of those. Let me see. Florida, I don't know. Like when Florida's on, their defense is better this season than last year.
For sure.
When they're on offensively, they can be pretty daggum good, but then they laid an egg against Kentucky offensively. You just kind of look at it and go, what are you guys doing? And that's actually been one of the Dan Mullen criticisms that I've heard out of Gainesville is he'll put together these amazing game plans for Alabama, and then they go out and kind of lay an egg against Kentucky, which is still, a very good team. This is how I look at it, Chris. I think right now, I'm going to try to be fair about it. They don't have a loss. I'm going to say Kentucky. I do not anticipate that's the case at the end of the year, right?
Yeah.
But I think we're just going off of record and what they've done. I think they've earned that right now. But Arkansas could certainly be better. They could end up being better in their Florida, even though they lost. They could end up having the second best record in the East or something like that.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, right now, you can't say Florida's the third best team in the league probably, but projecting forward just with what teams have. I mean, Kentucky's Kentucky's going to probably win 9 or 10 games and some of that schedule. I mean, and let's face it, too. Name a team in the league that if they played Alabama wouldn't have at least one loss right now, excepting Georgia. I mean, that's the thing is that was going to happen to most anybody. Going into Tuscaloosa and losing that game by 2 points to me was pretty impressive.
It was. It was very impressive. And also one reason why you look at now Florida's, talented offensively, and Dan Mullen's really good at what he does. But I think that's one reason that I kind of looked at that and I went, ooh, Alabama's defense, there's some questions there, right? So that's one reason why I kind of put Georgia over them too. So yeah, it is very interesting to project it forward. I think it's pretty close there between several teams. I don't know if Kentucky, for instance, can go and score, with some of the teams that they're going to end up facing this year. And I don't think, even though this is going to sound weird, even though they beat Florida, can they score on a consistent basis more than Florida this season? I don't really know. So I'll try to just be fair about it in my mind, at least, and say Kentucky, but I think it'll probably end up being a different team by the time the season rolls around or ends. I mean,
I know, you're covering an SEC East team. I know we both like to watch our share of SEC football. I don't know how much you've gotten to see LSU or stay plugged into that situation, but just everything I hear seems to indicate that Ed Orgeron probably isn't going to survive the year. I mean, I look at the total offense and defense numbers. I think they're +2 a game, which is just unreal with that talent and the fact that they haven't played a brutal schedule so far. And sometimes programs like that where you've got sky-high expectations, when the wheels come off, they do it in spectacular fashion. What do you make of that situation right now?
Well, so last year was a complete mess. It was a debacle, and I'm taking COVID out of it. But
agreed. I've heard the same thing too, by the way, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, the Bo Pelini shoehorning was something that was kind of I don't know that it was exactly Ed Orgeron's decision there, right? It was kind of this is kind of what's happening. And everybody that had either used to work at LSU or like knew people there, a lot of people looked around and said, this is not going to work. And then it did not. Like it failed pretty spectacularly. And there are a lot of issues there. And then you look at the off season, it wasn't smooth. Then you have all the off field stuff, which when, as we have seen, not just at LSU, but to be fair, but at other college programs, when teams are winning, you're a little or a lot more likely to brush aside some off-field issues, even if they're very significant, within the football program. And they've got some of those questions right now to answer. So I say that to illustrate the point of when it goes bad, those issues tend to get more magnified in the public and within the administration. They're going to look at it and say, okay, so it seems kind of a very kind of, I don't know about hanging on by a thread, but it's a very fluid situation. It seems like they do have tons of talent on that team. You can just go look at their recruiting rankings. You can go eyeball the team. They have lots of talent, but they have not, lived up to that. Now they just lost Derek Stingley for, an extended period of time. They haven't been able to run the ball. There are issues there for sure. Auburn just came back on them, so the defense let them down. Lots of issues. So I would not be surprised, if things eventually change there. And it's kind of crazy because that, a lot of people have drawn the Gene Chizik parallel, like you win a national championship with a generational talent in Cam Newton, which they had in Joe Burrow, that type of guy. And then a couple years later, you're out the door. And would that be a huge shock if that happened? Probably not.
Yeah, and here's the thing. You see ADs more and more trying to get a jump on other teams. I mean, I guess Southern Cal, the other SC, got a jump on everybody by making a move early in the season. And so you wonder how much that comes into play. You've got an AD in Scott Woodward who swings big. I mean, everybody said he couldn't get Kim Mulkey for their basketball vacancy from Baylor. He did that. I know he went hard after Tim Corbin. I don't think that was a battle he was probably going to win, but when they had a baseball vacancy, that's where he went. Here's a guy that he's going to take a shot somewhere. I don't know if that's calling Jimbo Fisher. I don't know that happens, but I mean, it wouldn't be surprised for him to make the attempt. And I don't think Fisher's buyout at A&M is prohibited at all. There was an article I read yesterday about that contract is very one-sided. So it's going to be very interesting just to see where this all goes.
It is. I read that same article that you're talking about, just the kind of Scott Woodward's history. And, there were some names starting out in there. For some reason, Urban Meyer was not in there. Can you believe that, Chris? That's kind of interesting.
Has anything happened that would have maybe disqualified Urban from consideration?
Honestly, with his track record, probably not. His probably is not disqualified.
Right. So, and by the way, God knows what went on at Florida under that guy, right? I mean, it's like you said earlier, when things are going well, stuff gets swept under the rug. And when things are not, the things that everybody overlooks earlier are the things they use to fire you when they need to do that. So just as an aside.
You're exactly right. But, Woodward's history dictates that he's going to go after a big name. Now, like, who is that? That's kind of my question. Like, is it Fisher, who just got a huge new contract? Like you said, it is one-sided. So Fisher took a look around and said, I'm good. I'll go on back to LSU. Maybe if both sides wanted that. Lane Kiffin's been thrown out. He's, despite what he says, my understanding is he kind of looked around and tried to go after the Auburn job this offseason. So it's not like it'd be some shock if Lane Kiffin wanted to look around. What other big names that are attainable, are out there? I'm sure there are some, but, Dabo seems entrenched at Clemson. He'd be one of the oddest fits ever at LSU, in my opinion. I don't think he's a fit at anywhere but Clemson, to be honest, and would be completely insane, in my opinion, for him to leave there. So I don't know who it'll be, but it would be a fascinating situation because that's a really, really good job. that a lot of coaches would jump at.
Chris, before we end today, and I appreciate you, I've kept you almost an hour. This has been terrific. I want to ask you about Carolina hoops, because Frank Martin goes to a Final Four several years back, has not been to the tournament since, if I recall. Last year, you just watched him on the sidelines. It just seemed like he wanted to throw up his hands at what he was seeing, and it was really odd because that's a guy whose players play harder from him year in and year out than just about anybody's, and effort looked like it was an issue a year ago. They don't have a lot of talent on that roster. I can't see that a Final Four appearance really ever gave them a bump in recruiting. They're going to be probably one of the 4 teams playing the Wednesday night game in the SEC tournament this year, if you look at the predictions that are coming out. Where's this all headed?
Well, it is a critical year. There's no doubt. Things in the off season at South Carolina got extremely interesting, to the point where, there was an expectation that something was going to get shaken up. It ultimately didn't. We would need to do another hour-long podcast to go into that, Chris, as to what kind of happened.
Yes, we would.
but it was wild. It really was. But so now what it is Frank's here. There was a lot of roster turnover, but the roster is very interesting now in how it's constituted. And I can tell you, there's kind of a little bit of a rejuvenation there. Frank Martin's he's been out in the media like even more than he typically is. And he seems excited about this team. Now, some fans are going to hear that and kind of roll their eyes. Well, we've heard this and that about the team in the past few years, that they can, something like, for instance, well, this is going to be the best shooting team, and then the season rolls around, they don't shoot very well, things like that. But there's a lot of excitement with this team as far as how they're constituted. And our understanding, Chris, and I think this counts for something, is this team has kind of gelled. They spend a lot of time together, like in big groups or as a team, and they seem to really play well off each other. And when you talk about Frank Martin teams, that's really important, because like you look at that Final Four team, they had such good chemistry. They were all close defensively, which is very important with Frank Martin teams. There has to be a lot of cohesion. And so the thought is that if some of that can translate onto the court, they're going to have a chance to maybe surprise some people. You look at the roster, they got some Columbia natives that have come back home. James Reese from North Texas as a graduate transfer, Chico Carter. Then you got, Eric Stevenson, who transferred out from, Wichita State. He's a guy. A.J. Wilson is a graduate. Then you return some pieces like Keyshawn Bryant. You get an LSU transfer in Josh Gray. A couple of freshmen that they really like with Devin Carter, at guard, and Jacoby Wright, a couple pretty highly rated guys. Jermaine Cousinard's back. So the feeling is that they've got some interesting pieces. We'll have to see how it comes together, but I do think that that's been maybe the most significant thing that we've heard in the offseason is this team has a chance to be a pretty cohesive team. And we've sometimes seen, Chris, in college basketball, that even if you're not the most talented team, that if you have experience, some talent, and you're a really cohesive team, you have a chance to make some noise. And so I think that's what they're banking on. But there's no doubt that this is a very important year for this basketball team.
Chris, you have been an outstanding guest. Gamecock Central is the best in the market at covering that beat. You guys put an incredible amount of time in. You're very well plugged in. Tell folks what's coming up at your site, where you want people to follow you on social media, anything like that you'd like to promote. The floor is yours to do that before we end the show.
Well, I really appreciate the kind words and you saying that. Follow us on Twitter at Gamecock Central. We're excited about continuing our coverage this season. We cover all sports, baseball, basketball, football, women's basketball, all that good stuff. We just made a new hire at our site, Mike Yuva, who we just hired this week, actually, and is going to be expanding our video content, doing a lot of neat stuff, analysis stuff, interviews, a lot of unique content that'll be coming on GamecockCentral.com the rest of this season. So I appreciate the plug, Chris, and I appreciate the time.
Chris, thanks for joining us. We hope to catch up with you later in the season.
Thank you, Chris.
All right, he's Chris Clark of Gamecock Central. I'm Chris Lee, the host of the 14 Podcast. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you again with more episodes next week.